On Christmas morning of 2010, snow fell on a quiet suburb in southwest England. But just after 9:00 a.m., the quiet was shattered by the sound of police sirens racing through town. The police cars came to a screeching stop, and a veteran detective inspector stepped out into the cold. He walked towards a stone wall that separated the road from a tree-covered field on the other side. The detective inspector reached the wall, crouched down, and started digging through a pile of snow and leaves. And when he saw what was underneath this pile, he knew he would not be spending Christmas with his family. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please glue together every other page of the book that the follow button is currently reading. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 6:00 p.m. on Friday, December 17th, 2010, a 25-year-old woman named Jo Yeates sat drinking and listening to Christmas music at the Bristol Ram pub with some of her co-workers in Bristol, England. Jo, who was a landscape architect, and her co-workers were regulars at this pub. But tonight, they were there specifically to celebrate an early Christmas together. Jo sipped her cider and looked out the window at the falling snow. The sun had just set, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlight. This, along with the holiday decorations on the shops outside, made the whole street look like the cover of a Christmas card. Jo looked away from the window and joined in on the conversation with her co-workers, who were talking about their various holiday plans. Jo said she was very excited because this was the first Christmas she was going to spend with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. Greg had gone on a weekend trip, but when he got back, they were going to spend a week with their family and then travel, just the two of them, to Scotland for Hogmanay, which is like a Scottish New Year's celebration. As Jo spoke about Greg, she couldn't help but smile. A few years earlier, she'd been a university student just trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life, and now she had a great job. She had a perfect little flat, and the man that she loved. Greg had recently started talking about getting married. Life was perfect. At about 8:00 p.m., so 2 hours after Jo had gotten to the pub, she wished all her co-workers a happy Christmas. She got up from the table, put on her long, cream-colored coat, and headed outside into the snow. It was cold, about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost -3 degrees Celsius, but Jo was used to the winter weather. She pulled her coat collar up around her neck and started walking home to her flat, which was about a 30-minute walk away. After walking for a while, Jo ducked into a convenience store to grab a frozen pizza, and then after that, she went into a small shop called Bargain Booze and bought 2 bottles of cider. And so now, with her food and drinks in hand, Jo continued the walk home. She knew her flat would feel empty without Greg there, but she was still looking forward to spending a relaxing Friday night with her cider, her pizza, of course, her cat. A little after 8:45 p.m., Jo finally approached her flat, which was a basement unit in an old stone house. Jo and Greg's landlord, a retired English teacher, lived in the unit right above them. Jo unlocked the outside door that led directly into her flat, and then she walked inside and put her food and drinks on the kitchen counter. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook near the door, slipped off her boots, and then called for her cat. But after calling for him, she didn't hear him clacking across the hardwood floor like she expected. She looked all around the flat, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Jo shook her head and went back to the kitchen. Her and Greg's cat was a bit of an escape artist. He frequently got out. Their landlord had found their cat in his place upstairs several times. And also, the cat had even made it across the small front garden to their next-door neighbor's place before. And so, Jo felt confident the cat would come home when it got too cold. And so for now, she just grabbed a cider, cracked it open, and sat down in the front room. And after she'd only taken a couple of sips, she heard a knock on the door. Jo hoped it was her landlord returning her cat, so she got out of her chair, opened the door, and when she saw who was there, she gave a huge smile. On the night of December 19th, so 2 days after Jo had met her co-workers at the pub, Her boyfriend Greg got back to their flat after being gone for the weekend. He unlocked the flat door, walked inside, and put his bag down on the floor. He was about to call out for Joe, but he heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. His and Joe's cat was meowing, but it sounded like the animal was afraid or angry. Greg walked into the kitchen, and he saw the cat pacing back and forth in front of an empty food bowl. This was really strange because Joe always made sure that bowl was full. And so Greg scooped some cat food out of the bag, dumped it in the cat's bowl, and then walked to the bedroom looking for Joe. However, she wasn't there. Greg figured she must have gone out with friends or something. He had messaged her when he was heading home, and he hadn't heard back yet, but he really hadn't thought much about it. However, when he stepped back into the front room, he actually looked around for the first time, and at this point, he did start to get worried. Greg saw Joe's coat, her boots, and her purse right there in the room. He knew how cold it was, and so Joe would never have left, at least not without her coat, and she definitely would not leave her purse behind. Greg grabbed his phone and called Joe, and as he did, he suddenly felt a chill come over him because he heard the sound of her phone ringing inside of her coat pocket right in front of him. Now Greg started to panic. Joe was one of those people who never went anywhere without her phone. And so he immediately dialed 999, the emergency number in the UK, and he told the operator that his girlfriend, Joe Yeates, was missing. In the early morning of December 20th, about 4 hours after Greg called 999, Detective Inspector Jeff Goff of the Avon and Somerset Police walked into the flat. Goff had been a police officer for over 20 years, and as such, he'd learned to remain even-keeled in almost every situation. He spoke in a soft, low voice, and the look on his face almost never gave anything away. Goff greeted a few uniformed officers who had arrived before him and walked over to Greg, who was standing in the front room looking frightened. The detective understood why Greg might be upset, but he didn't want to jump to any conclusions now. It was clear Greg's girlfriend had not been home when Greg got there, but besides that, the police didn't have a whole lot of information about what was even going on here. And so Goff introduced himself to Greg and asked him when was the last time he spoke to his girlfriend. Greg said that he had seen Joe a couple days earlier before he left town, but he hadn't talked to her since. Goff asked if it was odd that he would go to full days without speaking to his girlfriend, but Greg just shook his head and said no. He'd been busy while he was gone, and he figured Joe had been busy too, getting ready for Christmas. So that's why he must have missed her when he called. While Goff listened to Greg, he scanned the room. He could see Joe's coat, boots, and purse. Just like Greg, he did think it was strange that Joe would go out and leave all of those things behind, but still, this didn't prove a crime had occurred here. Goff also noticed 2 cider bottles sitting on a small table. One had a couple of sips gone, and the other looked untouched. Goff asked Greg if there was anything about Joe, like physical attributes or places she liked to frequent, that might point police in the right direction as they began the search for her. Greg gave a basic description of Joe. He said she was average height, had short blonde hair and blue eyes, and he said she'd been hanging out with co-workers the night he left town at a pub called the Bristol Ram. Goff jotted all of this down in his notebook, got details of where Greg had spent the weekend, and then joined a couple of officers in the kitchen. After spending a few hours in the flat, Goff and the other officers had not found anything that stood out to them. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and at least according to Greg, the front door had been locked when he got home. Goff told his team to speak to the landlord who lived upstairs and also to Joe's other neighbors to see if anyone had seen her in the last couple of days. For now, Goff was treating this as a missing persons case that he hoped would have a clear explanation and a happy ending. For all he knew, Joe had just left town without telling her boyfriend. Maybe she was with the person she'd gotten one of those ciders for, and maybe she took a different coat and purse with her and accidentally forgot her phone. I mean, it was just a thought. But either way, Goff felt confident. He could retrace Joe's steps from the moment she left the pub, and he could find her. Later that day, Goff sat at the station poring over CCTV surveillance footage from locations between the Bristol Ram pub and Joe's flat. Britain has more surveillance cameras per person than almost any other country in the world. This is why Goff felt so confident he'd be able to see exactly where Jo had gone on the last night anybody had heard from her. And he would be right. Using footage from storefront and street cameras, Goff followed Jo's walk out of the pub and through Bristol. Footage from inside the convenience store showed her buying the pizza, and he saw her go into Bargain Booze and walk out with 2 bottles of cider. Goff later picked her up on a street camera in her neighborhood that showed her walking towards her flat. So it looked like Jo had just gone home after going to the pub, and Goff could see she was wearing the coat and carrying the purse that had been found inside of her flat. However, Goff couldn't find any surveillance footage that showed Jo back on the street after she had gotten home. It was like she had gone inside of her flat and then just vanished. And when the entire day went by without any of Jo's friends or family hearing from her, Goff began to think that Jo very likely did not just ditch her boyfriend and leave town. And so Goff went to meet with Jo's parents, and when he did, he suggested they reach out to the press for some help. On December 21st, 2 days after Greg had reported Jo missing, Jo's parents went on the local news. They said they loved their daughter dearly, and they asked anyone who might have helpful information to please come forward. By the following day, Jo's story had hit the major newspapers in London, and her picture was being shown on TV news programs all throughout the United Kingdom. And soon, the story of the pretty young missing woman had become a public obsession. At 9:00 a.m. on Christmas morning, so over a week after Jo had gone missing, a couple was walking their dog down a snow-covered street that was about 3 miles away from Jo's flat. All of a sudden, the dog stopped, sniffed the air, and then looked over to the side of the road. The couple glanced in the direction the dog was staring, but all they could see was a stone wall, standing several feet high, that separated the road they were on from a field filled with trees on the other side. The man tugged on his dog's leash to try to get the dog moving, but his wife told him to actually stop. And then she walked over to the wall and knelt down to see what was there. And when she looked, she saw something bright buried beneath the snow and a pile of leaves. And as she leaned in closer, she screamed. A few minutes later, several police cars came to a stop on the road where the couple and the dog were waiting. Goff got out of his car and walked right past the couple towards that wall. On the ground, he could see part of a brightly colored T-shirt and a frozen blue human arm. Goff put on his gloves, and he was quickly joined by several forensics officers. And together they carefully dug into the snow and leaves until they revealed the frozen, dead body of a young woman. As soon as he saw her, Goff closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He really was almost always unflappable, but seeing something like this on Christmas of all days just shattered it. Goff walked away from the body, collected himself, and then he called Jo's parents to tell them he believed he had just found their daughter's body. Later that morning, after the body had been positively identified as Jo's, Goff and several forensics officers stood by the wall staring down at Jo. Goff wondered if maybe this was just a terrible accident. Maybe Jo had left her flat in a rush without her coat on, slipped on the snowy ground, and suffered some sort of injury that killed her, or that immobilized her and then she died of exposure. And because it had been snowing, her body would have quickly been covered and would have gone unnoticed. As Goff crouched down and searched the area around Jo's body, a few pieces of evidence jumped out at him. Jo was clothed. However, her shirt had been pulled up around her neck, exposing one of her breasts. He also saw bruising on her throat. And so right away, this did not seem like something that would happen from a fall. It looked like something that would happen in a sexual assault. Also, Goff noticed that Jo had on only one sock. But more specifically, he saw the bottom of her bare foot and the bottom of the sock on the other foot were totally clean. There was no dirt, no leaves, or any other sign that she'd been walking around in this area. It was like she'd been dropped here raw. Goff heard somebody call his name, and he turned to see a forensic biologist crouched down, looking at the wall nearby, gesturing to him. Goff joined her, and she immediately pointed to a section of the wall. Goff looked, and he saw there were blood stains running vertically up this one section of the wall, almost from the very top to the bottom. He looked at the forensic biologist a bit confused. She told him that these stains were not the kind of blood spatter that would occur from an attack. Instead, these were stains that would have been left when someone tried to lift Joe's bloody body over the wall and failed. Goff stood up and peered over the wall. On the other side was just a big field full of trees. Had someone been able to actually dump Joe's body onto the other side of the wall, meaning had they not failed to get her over, there was no telling how long it would have taken for someone to finally find her. Goff exhaled, and he could see his breath hanging in the air. The way Joe's body had been found and the bloodstain on the wall made it pretty clear. This was no accident. He now had a murder investigation on his hands. Goff also felt sure that Joe had not been walking along this road when she died, so his first thought was that she had been murdered somewhere else, probably near her flat, and then driven and dumped here. Goff knew the forensic team had a lot of work to do. However, they seemed very optimistic that the snow and the low temperatures had helped preserve the body, and so they hoped they'd be able to find blood or other DNA samples that might lead them to Joe's killer. So Goff left them to it, got in his car, and headed back to the station. Now that he was investigating a murder, he knew where he had to start, with Joe's boyfriend, Greg. That night, so Christmas night, Goff sat across from Greg inside of an interview room, and the young man looked like a total wreck. He told Goff this was supposed to be the first Christmas he and Joe were going to spend together, and he couldn't believe this was happening. However, as upset as Greg was, he was very cooperative throughout the interview. He gave Goff all the details of his weekend trip again. He again told the story of what had happened when he first came home, and he agreed to submit DNA samples. After that, Goff let Greg go. Since Greg was the victim's boyfriend, the detective would not completely cross him off the suspect list. However, Goff had already followed up on Greg's alibi after they met that first time, and it had checked out. Also, because there was no surveillance footage of Joe after she had gone inside of her flat and then disappeared, Goff believed the only person who could have carried out this murder would be somebody who lived basically inside of that building that the flat was in, because that's the only way they would escape being seen on camera going in and out of her place. And because this case was now all over the news, lots of other people in the United Kingdom were beginning to speculate the same thing. The killer must have been inside of that building when Joe went into her flat. But before Goff could even decide what to do about this theory, he got a phone call. On the other end of the line, he heard the sound of an older man's voice who was speaking with a very proper, posh English accent. And this man quickly introduced himself as Chris Jeffries, Joe and Greg's landlord and upstairs neighbor. And Chris told Goff that he had seen the news about the discovery of Joe's body, and he believed he had information that would help. He said on the night Joe went missing, he had seen a few people he did not recognize walking along the side of the house. In the days following this phone call, Goff followed up on the details of Chris's story, and the detective got the feeling that the landlord was not telling him the whole truth. The landlord, Chris, had been aware of the investigation since the moment police showed up after the 999 call. In fact, members of Goff's investigative team had taken a statement from Chris because he owned the building Joe lived in and was her upstairs neighbor. Now it struck Goff that, during that initial meeting, Chris had not mentioned these strangers he'd supposedly seen near the house. Chris had also told investigators that, on the night Joe went missing, he said he'd spent the entire night at home. However, since that initial conversation, Goff had reviewed additional surveillance footage. And late on the night of December 17th, the last night anyone had seen Joe alive, Goff saw a car on that footage that looked a lot like Chris's car driving across a nearby suspension bridge, indicating he had not been home the whole time. So on December 30th, 5 days after Joe's body was discovered, Goff met Chris at the police station and escorted him directly to an interview room. Chris had long white hair and he wore a sports coat and carried this small leather satchel. He sort of looked like an eccentric professor. Goff sat down at a small table across from Chris and asked him how his relationship with Joe had been. Did he have any issues with her? But Chris just shook his head. He said Joe and Greg were a nice couple and good tenants. He said the worst he could say about them was that sometimes their cat got out and found its way upstairs to his place. Goff asked Chris what he'd been doing on the night of December 17th, the night that Joe went missing. Chris immediately looked confused. He said he'd been home the whole night and hadn't seen anything unusual, just like he'd already told police. Now, Goff didn't raise his voice or even change his facial expression, but he said to Chris, "Hey, that's not true." Chris had called and said on the phone that he had noticed some unusual strangers walking by the house, and so he asked Chris, why hadn't he told the police about those people when they first spoke to him? Now a worried look came across Chris's face. He said he had only come here to help, but now it felt like he was being accused of something. But Goff just asked him again, why hadn't he told the police about the people he saw by the house? Chris kind of shook it off. He said it was the holidays and people in the neighborhood were having parties, so it didn't seem strange to him at the time that people were walking by the house. For a minute, there was just silence between the two men, and then Goff finally said on December 17th, surveillance cameras had caught a car that looked just like Chris's car driving across the suspension bridge that was the main route between Joe's flat and the location where her body was found. Chris looked totally stunned. He said there had to be a mistake. He never left his flat that night. It was too dangerous. It was snowing and the roads were bad, so he didn't want to leave his house. At this point, Goff just excused himself and walked out of the room. In all honesty, he really didn't know if Chris was guilty. Chris had easy access to Joe's flat, and that car on the surveillance footage could possibly be his. This was just too much to ignore, and so Goff needed a bit more time to fully dig into Chris's background and his seemingly flimsy alibi. Under British law, in the case of serious crimes like murder, police can apply to a magistrate to hold potential suspects for 36 hours without charging them. Goff felt confident a magistrate would allow him to hold Chris, and Goff was right. That night, police arrested Chris, took a DNA sample, and transferred him to a jail cell in the nearby facility. And for the first time, Goff felt like he had a legitimate suspect. The following morning, which was New Year's Eve, Goff sat at his desk staring at the front pages of multiple tabloid newspapers. Goff was very annoyed because, despite all of his team's efforts to hide it, news about Chris's arrest had gotten out. Goff slipped open one of the papers, and as soon as he did, he got even more upset. The paper had basically decided that Chris had murdered Joel. It was not just that he was arrested, but no, he was the killer. And their proof. Well, just how he looked and how he spoke. However, as upset as Goff was about this, the tabloid headlines actually ended up benefiting his investigation. Because that morning, while Goff waited to secure a search warrant for Chris's flat, he got a phone call. This caller said his name was Vincent Tabak, and he lived in the building right next to Joe's that also happened to be owned by Chris. Vincent said he had seen Chris's car earlier that night facing one direction, and the following morning, Chris's car was facing the opposite direction. When Goff heard this, he started to get excited. If he could prove Chris was lying about staying home on the night Joe went missing, he might be able to definitively link Chris's car to the one he'd seen on the suspension bridge in the surveillance footage. After Goff hung up, he immediately asked a detective on his team to follow up with Vincent to see if he might have seen or heard anything else that night. And then soon after that, Goff got the approval for a search warrant, and so he and his team headed over to Chris's upstairs flat. It was New Year's Eve, and as Goff drove across town, he believed he might actually be able to close this case before people all across the country popped open champagne bottles and welcomed in 2011. When Goff and his team walked inside of Chris's upstairs flat, it felt like they'd stepped into a library. The walls were lined with shelves that were overflowing with old books. Goff told his team to split up and begin their search, and it didn't take long before one of them called out from the kitchen. And so, Goff and the other officers walked into the kitchen, and they found that officer sitting on the floor, holding something that he'd found tucked under one of the kitchen cabinets. When Goff bent down to get a better look, he thought he was looking at the smoking gun that would wrap this case up. Because the officer on the floor was holding a pair of trainers, the British word for tennis shoes, and one of these trainers looked like it was stained with blood. Even the normally calm and collected Goff could not hide his excitement. Between this shoe, the call from the next-door neighbor, and the surveillance footage from the bridge, Goff felt like he was close to having enough evidence to build a strong case against Chris, and so officers bagged the trainer and had it sent off to the crime lab for expedited testing. And by the following day, which was New Year's Day of 2011, the lab came back with the test results. And on the same day, the The lab also reported that they had run tests on DNA samples they'd found on Joe's clothes and skin. And when all these test results came in, Goff knew that they had found Joe's killer. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here's what police believe happened to Joe Yeates on the night of December 17, 2010. Around 8:45 p.m., the killer stood outside of Joe's front door holding her cat. The killer clutched the cat close to their chest so it wouldn't dart off and then knocked on Joe's door. Joe opened the door, saw the cat, and immediately smiled. She apologized for the cat's behavior and thanked the killer for bringing her cat back. The killer said it was no problem, leaned in through her door, and put the cat down. And as the cat trotted off towards Joe's kitchen, the killer lunged at Joe, pushed her further into the front room, and slammed the door behind them. Joe screamed, but the killer immediately covered her mouth while they shoved her through the flat towards the bedroom. Joe tried to fight back, but it was happening so quickly, and the killer threw her onto the bed, pulled her shirt up around her neck, and grabbed at her chest. Joe struggled, and one of her socks fell off in the fight. The killer tried to keep her pinned down, but Joe let out this loud scream, desperately hoping somebody would hear her and save her and save her. The killer panicked and punched her in the face. Blood ran down Joe's cheeks. Then the killer just wrapped their hands around Joe's throat and squeezed. They sat on top of Joe, strangling her violently for over 20 seconds, until Joe stopped breathing and died. The killer got off the bed and walked to the front room. They could hear the cat walking around in the kitchen, but other than that, there wasn't any noise coming from the outside. The killer took a steadying breath, hoping they'd somehow manage to keep Joe quiet enough to not get detected. And so, the killer just sort of stood there for a long time, listening and planning their next move. About an hour after the killer had arrived at Joe's, they went back into the bedroom, picked up Joe, and carried her to the front door. With Joe in their arms, the killer opened the door, quickly locked it from the inside, then they stepped outside and closed the door behind them. Then they rushed to their car, opened up the trunk, and dropped Joe's body inside. Then the killer got in their car and sped across town in the snow. When they reached a dark, empty road with a wall running alongside it, they pulled over and got out. They scanned the street and saw nobody was nearby, so they carefully opened up the trunk, picked Joe up, and carried her over to the side of the road near the wall. The killer tried to lift Joe's body over the wall, but they just couldn't do it. She was too heavy, and so her body slid down the wall, leaving bloodstains on the wall from her face and neck. Finally, the killer just dropped Joe onto the snowy ground. They piled more snow and leaves on top of her and then ran back to their car and drove off. A few minutes later, they stepped back inside of their flat, hoping nobody had seen what they just did. Despite what some people in the media had already decided, Joe's landlord Chris Jeffries had nothing to do with Joe's murder. It would turn out Joe's next-door neighbor, Vincent Tabak, had killed her. Vincent was the one who had called police to say he believed that Chris, who also happened to be his landlord, had driven off in his car on the night Joe was killed, and that he was lying about being in his flat the whole time. Vincent had called police after reading about Chris's arrest in the tabloid newspapers. He thought it was a great opportunity to distance himself from the crime and solidify the police's belief that Chris was the killer. Now, when Goff spoke to Vincent, he learned that Vincent was in the Netherlands celebrating Christmas, meaning he was not home. Now, this didn't mean he was guilty, but it struck Goff as just a little bit suspicious. And so, he wanted to follow up with Vincent. So Goff contacted authorities in the Netherlands, and then Goff sent a detective from his team out to the Netherlands to meet with Vincent in person. Now, the interview itself did not provide any new information. However, the detective was able to get Vincent to submit a DNA sample. When the test results for the trainers that had been found in Chris's flat came in from the crime lab, it would turn out that, even though there might have been blood on them, there was no connection to the murder at all. However, the DNA samples taken from Joe's body and clothes that the crime lab had just tested as well did match the sample that Vincent had provided. After these results, Goff went back to the surveillance footage of the suspension bridge that was near the road where Joe's body had been found. The car in that footage was not Chris's after all. and police would soon discover that Vincent had taken a different, less direct route to the road, which is why he was never seen on camera. Goff secured a warrant, and he and his team searched Vincent's apartment. While they didn't find any specific evidence pertaining to the crime there, Vincent had been watching violent pornography on his computer, most of which featured men assaulting women and strangling them. After police arrested Vincent, they would learn that he didn't really have any real relationship with Jo. He had just seen her around the neighborhood and thought she was pretty. He had also brought Herkett back to her in the past, but over time, Vincent developed a violent obsession with Jo. He wanted to have sex with her and strangle her, and as Christmas of 2010 approached, Vincent decided he didn't want to wait any longer to act on this obsession. And when he saw Jo's cat outside on December 17th, he saw his opportunity. Vincent showed up at Jo's flat, returned her cat, and then killed her cat. Vincent was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. As for Jo's landlord, Chris Jeffries, who was all but proclaimed guilty in much of the yokai media, he's spoken at length in interviews, telling his side of the story and saying how all he wanted to do was help the police solve a horrible crime. Today's podcast will feature 3 medical horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Shadow, and it's about how one man's night of terror created devastating ripple effects. The second story you'll hear is called Night and Day, and it's about 2 brothers who suffer from nightly transformations. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Leg Pain, and it's about a seemingly minor issue that would ultimately escalate into one of the most baffling medical mysteries ever. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music Follow button is out of town, sneak into their house and prop open their refrigerator door, and then just leave. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Shadow. On the evening of July 25th, 2008, a 59-year-old man named Brian Thomas walked hand in hand with his wife, Christine, out of the restaurant where they had just had dinner. The couple was in this little village right on the coast of Wales, and where they were now walking outside of this restaurant was right along the water. And so, as they did that, Brian found himself looking out over the sea, and he saw the reflection of the moon on the waves. It was so beautiful, and then he turned to his wife and she was so stunning. And so, Brian finally just stopped and kind of just took in all this incredible beauty right in front of him, and he began smiling ear to ear to ear, which was a big departure from how Brian had been feeling over the past few months. Because Christine had recently had a big scare. She had been told she might have cancer. And so she went in for all this testing, and then she and Brian had to wait for it to come back, and the wait was absolute torture. I mean, basically, Brian and Christine were prepping themselves to find out Christine really did have cancer. But when the results did come back, it would turn out Christine did not have cancer. And so Christine was obviously hugely relieved, but it was actually Brian who was more relieved. It was like he suddenly saw he could lose his wife of 40 years, who he had raised a family with. I mean, this was like the most important person in Brian's life. But it was like he didn't fully appreciate that until he realized he could lose this really important person. And so now that Christine had a clean bill of health, Brian was committed to showering her with love and affection, taking her to restaurants and on vacations. And in fact, the reason they were actually in this village in Wales is because they were on one of Brian's many vacations for Christine. He had gone out and bought this little camper van, and they had driven it up to this part of Wales. And then after this vacation ended, Brian's plan was to use this camper to travel with his wife all over Great Britain. And so, the couple had a really busy schedule coming up, but for right now, Brian was focused on just staying in the moment and enjoying this newfound happiness he was feeling. And so he and his wife would continue to just kind of walk along the water for a bit, and then finally, when they felt tired, they headed back to their camper. They went inside, they got in their bed, and they fell asleep. A little before 4:00 a.m., Brian suddenly woke up inside of this camper. And so he sits upright and he looks around. It's totally dark inside of there. You can't see anything. He doesn't really know why he just woke up, and he's trying to get his bearings. And then as his eyes kind of begin to focus, he realizes there is a person standing inside of their camper right near the door. Basically 10-15 feet away from he and his wife as a person. And so Brian just froze, and he's staring at this person, hoping this is just a dream or something. But then this person, who appeared to be dressed in all black head to toe, began to move. And they began to move first to the left and then towards the bed. And so Brian is still just frozen thinking, is this real? Is this really happening? And then this person began climbing on the bed on the side where Christine was about to be. And so Brian, without even thinking, just yelled out, "You bastard!" And he jumped off the bed at this guy and began choking them out. And the whole time, Brian is screaming at this person like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And this person is fighting back so hard, and Brian is just not letting go. It's like instinct has completely taken over. And then this person goes totally still and just dies. And Brian knows he killed them, but they came into his camper. Like, what do you expect? Brian would ultimately be the one who called the police, and just several minutes later, they would show up. And when they got there, they would find Brian standing outside the camper hyperventilating. And then when they tried to get more information about what exactly had happened inside the camper, Brian basically couldn't explain it. It was like he was totally in shock. And so eventually, one of the officers just went inside the camper, and there on the ground they would find a body. But it was not some attacker, it was Brian's wife. It would turn out Brian had a medical condition called somnambulism, which we know as sleepwalking. And at home, he would sleep in a different bed than his wife because he sleepwalked so much. But since they were on vacation in their camper, they had to sleep together because there was only one bed on board the camper. And so not long after Brian and Christine had fallen asleep together, Brian began having this really intense nightmare where he believed his wife was being attacked. And so Brian, in this nightmare, had to stop this person from hurting Christine, except because of his sleepwalking, he acted this out in real life. And the attacker that he ultimately killed was, ironically, his wife. He basically tackled his wife and strangled her to death because he thought he was actually saving her. Brian was absolutely destroyed with grief and with guilt, and the second he realized what he had done, he confessed. He didn't in any way try to protect himself. He said, "I did this. Take me in." And Brian would be arrested. However, in November of 2009, the judge who actually heard Brian's official confession, he kind of felt bad for Brian and said, "You know what? I'm dropping all charges against you because it's obvious to me you are a good and decent person. This was a mistake, and you're going to live with grief and guilt for the rest of your life, and that's punishment enough?" Our next story is called Night and Day. In the late afternoon of May 1st, 2016, 13-year-old Shobi Ahmad and his 9-year-old brother, Abdul Rashid, chased his soccer ball across the dusty plain near their little rural town in Pakistan. Abdul, who was very athletic and quick on his feet, managed to kick the ball past the defender and then kicked a line, ducked her shot right at the net. But at the last second, the goalie jumped in, blocked the shot, and so Abdul threw his hands up in exasperation. But even though he was frustrated he missed his shot, he was having a blast. He loved playing soccer with his brother and the neighborhood kids. But as much fun as he was having, Abdul at some point looked up and he noticed the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. And immediately when he saw that, the expression on his face went completely deadpan. And then he looked over at his brother Shobi, who also had noticed the sun was setting. And by this point, Shobi was already rushing over to Abdul. He grabbed Abdul's hand and the two brothers, without a word to their friends who were just kind of standing there watching. They took off and just hustled back towards their home. The brothers made it to their home, but on the porch, Shobi, the older brother, just collapsed onto the ground with his arms and legs going totally stiff and his jaw arcing up to the point where he couldn't even speak. And Abdul, instead of trying to help his brother, just stepped clear over him and ran into the house and made it to his bed just in time for him to also collapse, but onto the bed, with his arms and legs being just as stiff as his brother's and his jaw also being locked so he couldn't even speak. And then moments later, the boy's father would scoop Shobi off the porch, carry him into the bedroom, and put him in a bed, cover him up, and then the father would rotate Abdul, who was on his stomach, over onto his back, and he put the covers over him. And then the father just left and got into his own bed and went to sleep. And this was a typical night in this family's household. The next day, a convoy of fancy cars descended on this little village where Shobi and Abdul live. And in these vehicles were all these scientists from Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. And they had heard about the boy's nightly bizarre collapses and they wanted to find out if the condition was real. Now, if the scientists had arrived in the village before sunrise, they would have found Abdul and Shobi still in their beds in a semi-comatose state and able to move. But it was almost noon by the time the scientists arrived, and so when they saw the two boys, they were outside goofing around in play, acting like everything was totally fine. In the village, neighbors referred to Abdul and Shobi as the Solar Boys because they were only normal and active in like the other kids during the daylight hours when the daylight hours sun was up, and then at night they would become totally paralyzed and mute. Now the villagers saw this happening, but they didn't really believe it necessarily. They thought maybe the kids were making it up to get attention, or maybe they were doing it as like a riff to get people to donate money to the family. But Shobi and Abdul's father completely denied this and said they had not made any money from what was happening to his sons, and all they wanted to do was just figure out what was wrong with them so they could help them. The scientist would talk to Abdul and Shobi's father first, and he would explain to them that really, since Abdul and Shobi were very little, they had been suffering from these nightly paralysis events. And so, with the family's permission, the scientists got to work. They collected blood and urine samples, not just from Shobi and Abdul, but from the entire family. And then also, the scientists tested Abdul and Shobi's balance and coordination, obviously during the daytime, and the boys both did completely fine. And then as sunset approached, the scientists just stood there and watched as Abdul and Shobi slowly lost control of their bodies and became paralyzed and mute. And then throughout the night, the scientists just continued to watch them, and the boys did not move at all. And then when the scientists attempted to kind of move their limbs for them, they were so rigid, almost like rigor mortis after you die, that they really couldn't move their limbs at all. And then the next morning, as the scientists were watching, the sun came up and it was like suddenly Abdul and Shobi were totally back to normal. They popped out of bed with a smile on their face, able to move around no problem. And so, to the scientists who watched this go on, they were left thinking, okay, there's no way these kids could be faking this. Like, no one could fake this. This is real. But the scientists really didn't have any new information to pass to the family because, the boys' blood and urine samples came back completely normal, and they had passed all of their balance and coordination tests. And so it seemed like, Abdul and Shobi should be totally normal, healthy boys, but they just weren't, and these scientists didn't know why. Now, these scientists were not the first group of people who had tried to solve the mystery of the Solar Kids. For years, their father had been trying to find someone who could help them, but he was having no success. Doctors in the nearest hospital to their village were convinced that the boys had a rare illness that made them extremely tired only a couple of hours after waking up in the morning. But Abdul and Shobi had loads of energy all day long. It was only when the sun came down that they became totally paralyzed. And so the father didn't believe those doctors were really taking this that seriously. The imam at a local mosque was convinced the boys were possessed by demons, and so he organized an exorcism where a group of religious leaders basically tapped on the boys with sticks while chanting in rhythm and dousing them with holy water. But that didn't work. And so the family was close to giving up on ever finding help for their sons. But then in April of 2016, so a month before that team of scientists descended on the village to research the boys, A TV news reporter from Pakistan's version of CNN came to the village to interview the family because this reporter had heard about the strange condition these boys had. And this interview was seen by millions and millions of people, including Pakistan's most esteemed and influential doctor, a man named Dr. Javed Akram, who happened to be the Vice Chancellor of Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Akram had never heard of such a strange condition, and so he was the one who ordered those team of scientists to go to the village and research this family. And after those scientists came back and checked in with Dr. Akram, it was clear they had not had a sort of breakthrough moment with regards to what was going on with these boys. But they were very convinced that this was a real condition, and so Dr. Akram decided that he and his team would just continue to study this family until they figured out what the heck was going on with these two boys. And finally, a year later, in May of 2017, Dr. Akram believed he had figured out what was wrong with them. And he even had a solution. But his solution was so simple that Dr. Akram actually kind of second-guessed himself, thinking, this is too good to be true. So the doctor decided he would run one more experiment, just to test his theory and make sure he really was correct. And so Dr. Akram flew Abdul, Shelby, and their father out to his institute in Islamabad. And that night, Dr. Akram watched as the two boys slowly slipped into paralysis as the sun went down. But this time, as soon as the paralysis was clearly beginning, Dr. Aykroyd gave each of the boys a pill, and 40 minutes would go by, and suddenly Abdul, who was totally mutant laying there still, broke into a smile, and then he raised his right leg, and then Shelby right next to him, he too smiled and turned his head. And then 20 minutes after that, both boys were up on their feet, totally fine, laughing and joking, because they had never really done anything at night. They were always paralyzed as soon as it started to get dark. It would turn out Dr. Akram and his team had discovered a very strange mutation in Abdul and Shelby. Our brains naturally produce all sorts of chemicals that keep them running, and one of those chemicals is called dopamine. Dopamine does several things, but one of those things is it controls muscle movement. The mutation that Dr. Akram and his team had discovered was that the boys' genes were mistakenly shutting off dopamine production every single night, and so that was why they were becoming totally paralyzed. This mutation was the result of a series of complex genetic mistakes, but the fix was actually quite simple. The pill that Dr. Akram gave Abdul and Shelby was just a dopamine pill, and what it did is it basically just turned the boys' bodies back on. And so Dr. Akram and his team had discovered quite possibly the world's rarest disease, only afflicting one family. But fortunately, they had also found the cure too. And so Abdul and Shelby, from that day forward, lived totally normal lives by taking their dopamine pills every night. The next and final story of today's episode is called Leg Pain. On the afternoon of February 1st, 2013, a retired Army veteran named Robert Smith limped his way into the emergency room at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Robert checked in at the triage desk, but then, instead of sitting down with the rest of the patients who were waiting, he leaned up against the wall and just grimaced. Robert was in his late 60s, and up until just a few days ago, he felt like he was in the best health he had been in since leaving the service. Robert had gotten a kidney transplant a year and a half earlier, and after getting that operation, he really wanted to make sure he stayed healthy. And so, he had been going on regular walks and eating healthy, and so really he was doing great. But a few days ago, Robert had noticed this throbbing pain in his right hip that was shooting pain all the way down his right leg. And he assumed, this had to be from maybe overdoing it on one of his walks. But the pain had continued to get worse and worse over the last few days, and so that was why he was finally here at the hospital. A nurse eventually called Robert's name, and so Robert, he came off the wall and hobbled over to her, and she led him down a hallway into an exam room. Once they got inside the room, the nurse would take Robert's vitals, which were all normal. And then after doing that, she said she was going to go out and get the doctor out. A couple minutes later, the doctor walked into the room, and she reviewed Robert's chart and talked to Robert about his symptoms. And then afterwards, she concluded that very likely what Robert had was something called sciatica. Sciatica is pain caused by pressure on the sciatic nerve, which travels from the lower back down each leg. And while sciatica is definitely very uncomfortable and very painful, it's not usually a big deal, and it typically clears up on its own without treatment. And so the doctor told Robert that he should just go pick up some ibuprofen, so over-the-counter pain medication, and take that every couple of hours and just wait for this thing to pass, and then he'd be fine. And so Robert was totally relieved. He thanked the doctor, he thanked the nurse, and then he left and headed back to his home. But despite doing what the doctor said and taking pain meds and just kind of taking it easy, the pain in Robert's leg did not go away. And then on the morning of February 4th, so 3 days after Robert's trip to the ER, he woke up and not only was his right hip and leg still sore, but now when he tried to stand up, he couldn't put any weight on his right leg. It just felt too weak, and it was kind of tingly. You know, something just felt off about it. And also Robert felt very nauseous. And so Robert told himself that, maybe what was going on here is he was taking too much ibuprofen and it was upsetting his stomach. And maybe it was also affecting his leg negatively or something. He didn't know. And so that day he just sat on the couch and watched TV, trying to tell himself that he was okay. It's just sciatica, Take a little less pain meds and you'll be okay. But that didn't work because the next day when he woke up, he was in even worse shape. Now, he not only had this pain and weakness in his right leg and he had nausea still, but also he now had this new pain in his abdomen that was located right around where the scar was from his kidney transplant. And Robert was also starting to spike a fever. And fevers in transplant patients are a really big deal because a fever in a transplant patient could mean an infection. People who get transplants are then given medication to keep their bodies from rejecting their new organ or organs. This medication works by basically suppressing that person's immune system. This prevents the body from mistakenly attacking the new organ, but it also means that if their body gets a real infection, they will have a really hard time fighting it off because, again, this medicine is basically stopping the immune system. And so, when Robert saw he had a fever in conjunction with these other symptoms that were not going away, he knew he had to go back to the hospital, because obviously this was not just sciatica. Robert was too sick and weak to drive himself to the hospital, so he asked his neighbor to drive him. And as they were driving to the hospital, Robert basically sat in the passenger seat rocking back and forth, not saying anything cause he was so uncomfortable. And the neighbor, the whole time they're driving, they just kept looking over at Robert, because not only did Robert look totally miserable, but also Robert was sweating profusely, like so much so that it looked like he had just sprinted a 5K. I mean, he was drenched in sweat. And so the neighbor's looking at him thinking, what's wrong with this guy? Finally, the neighbor arrived at the hospital and Robert, he managed to get out on his own, and he thanked the neighbor. And then Robert hobbled his way back through the doors into the ER, and then a few minutes later, Robert was in an exam room. And his doctor walked in and she took one look at him and saw how horrible he looked. And without any hesitation, she said, "You're getting admitted right now." It was clear to Robert's doctors that he had some kind of virus or infection that his body was trying unfailing to fight off. When they tested his blood, they saw his white blood cell count was elevated, which is a sign that the body's immune system is launching some kind of a response. But the doctors didn't know what his immune system was responding to. Even though Robert had this acute pain in his abdomen around the site of the kidney transplant, his kidney seemed to be working just fine. And so whatever was going on with him didn't seem to be linked to his transplant. The profuse sweating did seem pretty odd, but considering Robert had a really high fever, it wasn't totally inexplicable. So basically, Robert's symptoms were weird but kind of generic. They didn't tell the doctor specifically what was wrong with him. They just knew something was wrong with him. So they just hooked Robert up to an IV and began administering a broad-spectrum antibiotic, which is something that treats a whole variety of different infections. And then after that, the doctors just began testing Robert over and over and over again for all these different things that could be the cause for his illness. But every test they ran came back negative. And at the same time, over the couple of weeks that they ran all these tests, Robert just kept getting sicker and 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 sicker. His fever wasn't going away, he was still sweating profusely, his blood pressure was all over the map, and he had even begun drooling almost uncontrollably, to the point where he didn't even speak because he was so embarrassed about it. But to the doctors, the scariest symptom that Robert was now showing 2 weeks into staying at the hospital was he was starting to act really confused, like he didn't know where he was, he didn't know why he was there. And so that told the doctors that, whatever his body was fighting, it had made its way up into his brain. And so the doctors knew, Robert did not have much time left, but they had tried every test they could think of, and Robert had tested negative for all of them. And so, as kind of like a Hail Mary, because they had nothing to lose, the medical staff decided to just start testing Robert for basically completely random diseases that he almost certainly did not have. But basically, if any of these illnesses had a symptom that Robert had, they would test him for it. And all these tests came back negative except for one. On February 22nd, so 17 days after Robert had been admitted to the hospital, this test came back positive. And when the doctor saw what he was testing positive for, they immediately assumed this has to be a mistake. There is no way he has that. However, the only way to truly confirm that diagnosis was too literally cut into Robert's brain, which would kill him. And so obviously, they were not going to do that. So the doctors basically just had to take this diagnosis at face value, and they tried giving various medications to Robert, but it was obvious none of them were working. So the doctors felt like there wasn't much they could do, and they just began focusing instead on keeping Robert comfortable. And then finally on February 27th, so 22 days into Robert's stay at the hospital, he would die from this mystery illness. During Robert's autopsy, the medical examiner was able to perform the test that doctors could not perform on him when he was alive, and that was to cut into his brain. And when the doctor cut into his brain, he saw very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, that yes, Robert really was positive for that very, very rare virus, and it absolutely is the thing that killed him. But this was not the end of the case, because the virus that killed Robert was not just rare, it was also highly contagious, which meant the doctors needed to figure out how Robert got this virus to protect other people from getting it too, but the staff at this hospital knew they were not equipped to lead this investigation. And so they handed the case over to the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, which is the world's leading disease tracking agency. Investigators for the CDC began looking into Robert's case. A couple of days later, they sifted through the days and the weeks leading up to Robert's hospitalization in an effort to try to retrace Robert's footsteps to figure out what made him sick. Now they didn't have any leads. The only thing they agreed on was that very likely, even though Robert had that pain around his scar where the transplant was, that very likely the transplant did not have to do with whatever killed him, because Robert's kidney had been working fine and his transplant had happened 17 months earlier. And typically complications from transplants will happen much sooner. And so they basically had ruled the transplant out as being the cause. But one of the CDC investigators decided to look into the transplant file anyways, just to see if maybe something got missed or if maybe there was some detail about the donor that was relevant to what happened to Robert. And so this investigator got the file and began going through it. Robert's donor's name was William Edward Small, and at the time of his death, he was 20 years old and serving in the Air Force. Now, none of that stood out to the CDC investigator, but William's cause of death definitely did. Even though it really did not appear to have a connection to Robert, it was just so weird and unexpected. The CDC investigator would read that, back in September of 2011, William was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and he caught a fish and he ate that fish and he ate that fish and it gave him something called Chiaguatera poisoning. Chiaguatera poisoning is something you get when you eat a fish that contains microalgae toxins. And so William, he ate this fish that was contaminated, and not long after that he had died. But when the CDC investigator read through all of William's symptoms before he died, they basically exactly lined up with all of Robert's symptoms. William had developed pain and weakness in his extremities, he developed a very high fever, he became nauseous, he also lost the ability to swallow, And then he became totally confused and then died. And so when the CDC investigator saw this incredible coincidence, she knew she was onto something. But first she would need more information about William. And so very quickly, the CDC got in touch with William's family, and they asked them all these questions about William. And finally, after hearing the answers from the family, the CDC finally figured out what actually happened to Robert and what actually happened to William. It would turn out William was not just a fisherman. He was also a hunter and a trapper. And he had a very specific way he would go about training his hunting dogs. He would capture wild raccoons and use them as live bait to train his hunting dogs how to hunt. Now, William was always very cautious with these wild raccoons, but in the year and a half leading up to his death, he was bit 2 different times by raccoons. And it was one of those raccoon bites, not some toxic fish in the Gulf of Mexico, that killed William and killed Robert. William did not die from Chiiguatera poisoning. He died from rabies. And the rabies virus that was in his kidney was still present when it was taken out of his dead body and transplanted into Robert's body. And so that was how Robert got rabies. Rabies can look like the common flu at first. People feel achy and nauseous, they get fevers, their stomach starts to hurt. Some people affected by rabies will drool uncontrollably like Robert, or they'll lose the ability to swallow like William. But for everybody who contracts rabies and who does not get a vaccine right away, because the vaccine does stop rabies in the early stage, so if you don't do that, everybody dies. That's what rabies does to you. It kills you, it kills you. Now you'd think, maybe we should be testing organs for rabies before they get transplanted. But you gotta remember that rabies is so rare, only 1 or 2 people a year in the entire United States will die from rabies. And so it's just not something doctors are gonna screen for, because the percentage chance that they could have rabies is basically 0 all. Ultimately, Robert was not the only person who received an organ transplant from William. There were 3 other people that received his organs. Luckily though, the CDC was able to track those 3 people down, and all of them were totally healthy and not showing any signs of rabies. So either they didn't have it or they were super early stage, which meant they were eligible for the rabies vaccine. They all got the vaccine, and they lived happily ever after. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.